Imagine living in a place where the same water that sustains life also threatens to destroy it, where the seasons don't follow a pattern, but rather an unpredictable roulette wheel between devastating floods and droughts that ravage the earth until it cracks, where two of the region's largest rivers, immense, mighty, and revered for centuries, have become at once a source of hope and a source of fear. There, every drop is a cause for celebration or terror. For decades, millions of people lived in this brutal imbalance. Floods swept away crops, homes, and entire bridges. At times, the water level rose so rapidly that residents had only minutes to flee. Entire families lost everything. And when the water finally receded, the barren land revealed the other side of the nightmare: drought. In times of drought, the hardened soil made farming impossible. Men dug with their hands for moisture. Women walked miles for a bucket of water. Children grew accustomed to seeing livestock die of thirst, wells dry up, and schools become makeshift shelters. Climate instability wasn't just an environmental problem. It was an existential challenge, a constant test of human resilience. Duality seemed invincible. It was as if nature were trapped in a cycle of extremes that no one knew how to break. While rivers like the Godavari and the Krishna offered abundance, their waters, when left unchecked, turned against communities. No dam, canal, or drainage system seemed capable. Each season brought a new threat, a new adaptation, a new open wound. Agriculture, the main source of livelihood for the majority of the population, became a game of chance. Planting was no longer a strategic decision, but a desperate gamble. And with each failed harvest, desperation grew. Families fell into debt, migrated, and abandoned their lands. Little by little, what was once a fertile and promising home transformed into a field of uncertainty and constant struggle. But most impressive was the people's resilience. Even in the face of cyclical collapse, entire communities continued to resist. Men and women who learned to plant in the mud and pray for rain in dry times. Indigenous peoples who knew the rhythms of the earth like no one else, and who watched with sadness as their territories were destroyed. Their collective strength kept alive the hope that one day, perhaps, this imbalance could be overcome. And it was in this chaotic and painful scenario that the idea of something grand was born. A human intervention capable of confronting nature's fury, taming the wild waters, and restoring the predictability it so desperately needed to the land. A dam. One of the largest the world has ever seen. A project that, at first glance, seemed impossible, but which began to take shape in the first half of the 20th century. It was in 1941, amid a world plunged into war, that a silent proposal began to gain a voice. It wasn't a grandiose idea born in luxurious offices, but rather an urgent need expressed by technicians, engineers, and local leaders. The construction of a reservoir that could store and control the waters of the mighty Godavari River. A plan to prevent abundant rainfall from turning into tragedy and to prevent scarcity from defining the fate of millions. At the time, the proposal seemed too bold. Technical conditions were precarious, resources limited, and political support almost non-existent. The region continued to be overlooked on investment maps. The project, which seemed more like a vision of the future, ended up shelved for decades, like so many other dreams interrupted by the weight of reality. But great ideas don't die. They just slumber. And it was in the following decades, as the cycle of natural destruction continued relentlessly, that the project resurfaced. Amid meetings, studies, and promises, something began to take shape with greater force. In the 1980s, a symbolic ceremony took place. The cornerstone of the future dam was laid. At that moment, it was believed that the project would finally come to fruition. But time, once again, played a cruel trick. Years passed. Governments changed. Funding evaporated. The construction that was supposed to transform the region's history was nothing more than a forgotten landmark amidst the arid land. The project slumbered, suffocated by bureaucracy, political disputes, and murky interests. It was as if fate were doomed to repeat the same pain, year after year. It was only in 2004, more than 6 decades after the first proposal, that the project finally took concrete shape. A new political cycle, combined with a wave of investment and growing public pressure, allowed the dam's first pillars to begin to emerge. Excavators invaded the landscape. Workers erected structures where before there had been only dust and promises. The beginning was symbolic, yet powerful. For the first time, the population saw something real being built. Hope, so often buried by floods and droughts, seemed to be reborn. But the journey was only just beginning, because what was unfolding there was not just an engineering feat. It was a battleground between vested interests, administrative failures, and crises that threatened to engulf everything once again. Contracted companies were unable to meet deadlines. Bidding processes dragged on in legal disputes. The budget began to spiral out of control. The population, who had believed so strongly in that dream, now witnessed the emergence of a new nightmare. The fear that everything, once again, would be left half-finished. Still, the first concrete blocks marked a point of no return. Even amid mistakes, delays, and scandals, the work continued. Each meter advanced was a small triumph, each pipe buried in the dry soil, a seed of hope. The dream was finally taking shape. But the road to complete realization was still far from over, and the storms that would follow would be greater than any predicted in the technical reports. Gradually, the horizon began to change. What was once just arid, unstable land became shaped by colossal structures. Concrete towers stood like sentinels. Giant machines worked day and night, piling rocks, digging canals, and erecting the first traces of one of the largest dams ever built on that continent. The scale of the project surpassed any initial expectations. The dam spanned the violent course of the river like a colossus over 3.5 kilometers long. The spillway, with 48 solid steel hydraulic gates, seemed like a wall capable of containing even the most rebellious waters. At over 50 meters tall, it was as if engineering had decided to face nature head-on. But behind the grandeur lurked a labyrinth of problems. The technical complexity of the construction was only the first challenge. Bankruptcies soon followed. The original company responsible for the project couldn't withstand the financial pressures and abandoned the project. A new contractor took over, but also couldn't keep to the schedule. Interruptions became frequent. What should have been a steady stream of progress became a game of endurance, with each stage being hard-won. Meanwhile, costs soared. The initial budget of $1.5 billion ballooned to over $6 billion, and later to $13.5 billion. Each year, new audits revealed irregularities, overpricing, delays, and inefficiency. The public grew suspicious. Some believed the project would never be completed. The project, which promised salvation, threatened to become a symbol of waste and failure. But the greatest impacts weren't just visible in the spreadsheets. They were in the people. More than 200,000 people were directly affected by the construction progress. Entire communities were displaced. Indigenous peoples, who had inhabited these lands for centuries, saw their homes, forests, and rituals swallowed up by progress. For many, the dam wasn't a milestone in development. It was the end of a way of life. The promised compensation was rarely enough. Promises of rehousing, Infrastructure and social support often remained just paper. The forests also paid a heavy price. Entire areas of native vegetation were submerged. Species were threatened. The ecological balance was disrupted. Environmentalists warned the environmental bill would be unpayable. At the same time, the political climate became increasingly volatile. Governments changed, and with them, the contracted companies. With each change, new contracts, new negotiations, new legal battles. The project passed through different hands, conflicting visions, and divergent interests. The dam became a political currency, used in campaigns, electoral promises, and partisan disputes. Yet, despite the failures, losses, and setbacks, construction continued. The structure took shape, inch by inch, like a giant refusing to fall. And behind it all, a silent question remained. Would it all be worth it in the end? Because what was being built there wasn't just concrete. It was a gigantic organism, about to come to life. After years of promises, stalls, and controversy, the colossal structure finally began to fulfill its original purpose. Behind the steel gates, behind each concrete block molded under sun and rain, something grand began to pulse. Water, in unimaginable volumes, began to be controlled, redirected, and distributed. For the first time, that land marked by extremes felt the real impact of the project. And that impact was monumental. Inside the dam, hidden among humid corridors and titanic gears, a hydroelectric plant began to operate. Equipped with 12 80-megawatt turbines, the total generating capacity exceeded 960 megawatts. This was enough energy to power millions of homes, power industries, and light cities that previously depended on fragile and unstable systems. For the first time, entire regions had continuous access to electricity. But the dam didn't just provide energy. The engineering went further. 2 gigantic canals were built. The right canal, 173 kilometers long, and the left canal, 182 kilometers long. These canals together carry more than 28 billion liters of water per day. Water that had previously overflowed in destructive floods now followed precise paths, like veins bringing life to previously dry and forgotten parts of the body. The system was so robust that it allowed for the irrigation of over 900,000 hectares of agricultural land. Regions that had previously depended on the uncertainties of the weather could now plan harvests with confidence. Farmers who had lost everything to floods or droughts were able to start over. The soil began to breathe again, and with it, an entire economy. But there was one detail that made everything even more impressive: the lift irrigation systems. Modern techniques allowed water to be pumped to higher elevations, which would naturally not be reached by gravity. Projects like PSEMA, Sintsalapu, Purushottam, and Uttar Andhra began to serve isolated agricultural communities and entire cities, bringing a constant supply to areas that previously suffered from chronic scarcity. In terms of capacity, the dam operated with an active reserve of 93 billion liters, but its total capacity exceeded 240 billion. It was as if an ocean had been tamed and placed at the service of the population. Every liter transported meant food, work, and health. Most impressive, however, was the system's degree of integration. The dam was not just a source of energy or a reservoir. It operated as a nerve center, coordinating urban supply, rural irrigation, flood control, and water reserve preservation with precision. An engineering and logistical complex that needed to function like a living organism, and finally, it did. For many, this was the turning point. The moment when the ancient dream ceased to be a promise and became reality. A symbol of technical and human resilience, a response to a nature out of balance, but also a constant reminder of the price paid. Because even with everything working, the voices of the displaced, The voids left in the forests and the mistakes made in the process could not be erased. The heart of the dam beat strong, but the future still held uncomfortable questions. The world began to pay attention. What had once been a regional project, lost in the pages of technical reports and local headlines, began to be cited in international forums, engineering studies, and diplomatic meetings. The dam's scale, its complexity, and the impact it generated aroused the interest of even global powers. Among the most attentive observers was China. The country that built some of the largest hydraulic structures on the planet, including the imposing Three Gorges Dam, now turned its attention to this newly completed colossus. The comparison was inevitable. In terms of ambition, complexity, and speed of execution, the project earned landmark status, an engineering feat worthy of admiration and competition. What most impressed international experts was the pace at which certain milestones were achieved. One of them broke records. In just 24 hours, more than 32,000 cubic meters of concrete were poured into a single foundation block. This number alone went down in history as one of the largest concreting operations ever recorded in the world, a feat that demonstrated not only technical capacity, but also unprecedented human and logistical mobilization. As construction progressed, the government set clear goals: deliver the first phase by 2026 and complete the entire project by 2027. This time, with tight schedules, reinforced oversight mechanisms, and public pressure that brooked no further delays. The order was clear: do not stop, do not deviate, do not fail. The work had to be completed, whatever the cost. But the project's enormity carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. Initial cost estimates, which hovered around $1.5 billion, had multiplied almost tenfold. With the budget reaching $13.5 billion, many voices began to question: where did all that money go? The project's effectiveness was still a topic of debate. Audits, investigations, and complaints persisted, and the trauma caused by forced evictions, environmental devastation, and broken promises still echoed. Even with all the progress, the social impact was still felt. Displaced families awaited promised compensation. Children grew up far from the villages where they were born. Indigenous peoples tried to preserve what remained of their culture on makeshift lands. The forests did not return. The past was not corrected. And so, the dam remained a paradox, a symbol of victory and loss, of progress and trauma, an impressive human feat, yet marked by invisible cracks. Behind every spinning turbine, every liter of water pumped, were broken stories. The question was no longer whether the project worked, because it did. The question was it worth it? In time, perhaps the answer will come. Perhaps the fruits of irrigation, energy, and flood control will multiply. Perhaps those who lost their homes will find new homes, new lives. Or perhaps in the silence of the dammed waters, a bitter reminder remains that all greatness has a cost, and that sometimes that cost is greater than we can calculate, because works can be completed, but wounds, some, never fully heal. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.